Hello everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, I am one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your other host, Zach.
And as is requisite of us before we hop into the actual main topic of today's conversation, which is going to be very Xbox heavy. Sorry if we've kind of leaned into that recently, but this is going to be a little bit different. First off, thank you to all of our returning listeners. It's great that you've stuck it out with us. If you are one of the people who found us via YouTube, a platform that's kind of taken off unexpectedly for us, welcome to the show. Hopefully, if it's your first time, you enjoy this one. And if it's not, welcome back. If everyone listening or watching wouldn't mind sharing the show with a friend, mortal enemy, as I like to say, or casual acquaintance, that's always helpful. Or just following, subscribing, whatever you see fit. That's a huge, huge help.
Yeah, and today, as you said, we will be talking about Xbox again. Although I will say, we will not be deep-throating
yes, okay.
Xbox. Yeah, I could sense whether or not you wanted to talk about the deep-throating. We had a comment in one of our videos that we perhaps were deep-throating Microsoft.
Yeah,
which is not invalid for what we were saying, I guess. I don't know. I still think my favorite thing about the comment was that it was so critical in kind of like a mean, like, oh, that feels kind of bad way, but it was like weirdly constructive at the same time.
Yeah,
I don't know. It was strange.
It was a beautiful crystalline internet moment that is probably of very little interest to anyone other than us specifically. But yeah, on one of our previous episodes, we were... the tone makes me want to use the word accused of more or less filleting Xbox for the first like 20 minutes of, I think it was our Dragon Age Veilguard episode.
It was for season or the summer thing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But the comment itself also contained some like surprisingly constructive feedback that actually resulted in us making material changes to like putting timestamps and whatnot in our YouTube content. So thanks, I guess. But it was just fascinating to get like useful feedback, but in the envelope of a snarky internet comment. It was a beautiful moment. But yes, we are going to be doing a little bit less pleasuring of Xbox possibly in this one, because we are talking about the Game Pass price hike, which has kind of been a conversation simmering in the background of a lot of stuff for the last couple of weeks, while Xbox has been trying to ride its Summer Game Fest wave into, hopefully a successful season with Call of Duty and other such things. And they recently announced some structuring changes to the Game Pass subscription service, as well as price increases that seem to have implications outside of more or less reacting to inflation. So we thought today it might be worth kind of unpacking what some of those changes are, how they're kind of confusing, and then, what the causes might be, the implications, all that fun stuff that you come to us for every other week to talk into your ears about.
Yep. And I will say that most people are pretty pissed off about the changes.
It's not been positive, really, the reception.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not a feel-good story. So there might be some apologia on behalf of Microsoft from me, or rather, I should say, context providing around why some of the things have likely happened. But most people are mad, including the FTC, which we'll get into, which is kind of interesting. But to what Aaron mentioned, ultimately it's been a not just pricing change, but also a change of the tiering and how the tiering works. So now, granted, I am a Game Pass Ultimate subscriber, So I used to have that plan, but ultimately I don't really look at Game Pass all that much on a day-to-day basis. My understanding, though, is, at least from what I can remember, everything used to just be Game Pass Ultimate. There was the base version, or the two base versions. One was Game Pass for PC or PC Game Pass, and then there was PC or Game Pass for console or console Game Pass, and then there was Xbox Live Gold, which is, of course, their live service subscription or multiplayer service subscription.
Think back to. I mean, this is not going to be hugely nostalgic for anybody, but it's basically the holdover from the 360 era, back when it was kind of still in contention whether or not platforms were going to start charging people across the board for access to online multiplayer, because PlayStation Plus used to have free online multiplayer for the base version, and then the upcharge for a couple free games a month or something like that, whereas Xbox Live Gold was your pay every month to access online multiplayer for games like Call of Duty or other popular multiplayer games of the time. So that was still technically under the same name, even.
Well, it's
but
functionally
the structure hadn't changed.
Game Pass, or not Game Pass, sorry. Xbox Live Gold is the same. I mean, they had different tiering. There are different benefits. So, and I can't even remember that. I didn't even look at any of that because it ultimately doesn't really matter, because part of the change that just happened is they're really trying to push Game Pass and Xbox Live into the same subscription service. So that's kind of what we see uniformly for the most part across all of these different editions, is that Xbox Live Gold is being put into a lot of these different subscription tiers. Some of the new ones are the Xbox Game Pass Core, which is kind of the same as the Game Pass for console, but it's honestly just kind of worse, because instead of having the whole catalog of Game Pass games, I think it only has 24 different Game Pass games. I wasn't able to get clarity on what those were necessarily. Also, I don't think it'd be very interesting if I read all 25 of those catalog titles out to you, Aaron. But it's basically kind of what Game Pass for console was, where it was, actually, I guess that didn't have multiplayer. So now it has multiplayer. You get the discounts for Xbox and then 25 catalog titles, and it's at that same price point of $10.
Yeah.
But
My
a lot of the
understanding
contention
is that was more or less the replacement for Xbox Live Gold. This is how you access the multiplayer component, and there's a couple of free games thrown in for good measure.
Yeah, that's honestly what it feels more like to me, is that Game Pass Core is kind of a better version of Xbox Live Gold. And then what you would have thought of as Game Pass for console is now the closest thing to it is Game Pass Standard, which is not a service yet, that hasn't been pushed out yet. I was really confused, Aaron. I was trying to find Microsoft information, but it's not. It's been discussed, but it is not on the Microsoft site yet.
If this component of the conversation is confusing to anybody listening, fear not, you're not alone. I've watched now multiple sort of, not panel discussions, but having a couple of people trying to suss their way through describing all of these different tiers and the changes from the previous layout, and it just inevitably comes out into this weird corporate sounding alphabet soup. It's not hugely intuitive, so if you're struggling to keep up, don't worry about it. You're not alone.
Well, and it's one of the things of all the tiering and pricing models, actually the Game Pass one is not particularly confusing. It's just when you've got any level of things that are named the same thing and then something else,
a suffix.
It's just hard to keep them all straight unless you have a chart. But to your point, I think maybe the best way to just describe it is basically what used to be console Game Pass or Game Pass for console went up in price by about $5. And they also took off of that version day one exclusives, which are one of the things that in a lot of people's eyes really made Game Pass stand out in comparison to something like PlayStation Plus. And now you're functionally paying more money for something where you, in some people's eyes, get less. is what they're arguing. And then of course you had some price increases for like Game Pass for PC and Game Pass Ultimate, which is the thing that comes with everything. But generally speaking, for the purpose of the conversation today, I think the one that pisses the most people off, Aaron, seems to be the price change for Game Pass Standard. At least that also seems to be the case with the FTC criticism, in my opinion and understanding from reading.
Yeah, my general understanding here is because Game Pass Ultimate, and we will get into the perhaps necessity almost of increasing the price of Game Pass Ultimate. But the major difference, not the major difference, the major point of contention rather here does seem to be the price on every single tier has gone up. Basically, some tiers have been eliminated, at least for purchase. Like, you can still actually, if you already have an active subscription for Game Pass for console, you're not going to lose access to it. It's just you can't sign up for it anymore. But the main point of contention, as I've now said 8 times trying to lead into this sentence, is basically that they've pay-gated day one releases behind Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, which now costs more, up to $20 a month, and people are frustrated that that benefit was also taken away from Standard, while Standard's price also increased. So there's an argument that the main affordable-ish version of it has seen product degradation as a direct result of these day one release things being now segregated over into Game Pass Ultimate exclusively. So, especially since I think Game Pass Ultimate still comes with probably some things that aren't much more than value adds for a lot of players, like EA Play.
It has the Riot, I don't remember what they're selling it as, but it has like the whole Riot partnership as well, where you can get all the characters for League of Legends and Valorant. And
yeah,
I haven't looked at the benefits recently, but it's if you play Riot games, it is kind of sick, actually.
Yeah, like for a select group of players, that's a great value add, but I don't know if that's like maybe I'm just really out of the loop and Riot's games are, you know, as big as a Call of Duty sort of thing, but to me that just seems like a slightly more niche value add. Not necessarily something that you're going to see like blasted out and people are going to be going crazy as a result of a Super Bowl commercial for it. But you know, that's maybe just me. But yeah, so the FTC is kind of pissed off about the product degradation angle, and the other key factor here is that it does kind of coincide with the release of Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which is applying yet another even more intense lens on the importance of those day one releases on Game Pass.
And to the FTC criticism, it's a lot of it is around the fact that they're saying Microsoft stated during the court proceeding that they were not going to increase prices for Game Pass, you know, fall or ahead of the Black Ops 6 launch. There was this whole thing where there was concern that they were going to leverage games like Call of Duty Black Ops to kind of put the chokehold on PlayStation or charge users more. And Microsoft had said during, you know, the court proceeding when they were trying to acquire Activision Blizzard, they told the FTC and the US government that that wasn't something that they were going to do. So the FTC is now saying, look, you're doing product degradation, like Aaron just said, and then also you're increasing the price for users by like roughly 36%, and there's no day one games. So this is a worse product than it used to be.
That costs more.
That costs more, yeah, preceding Call of Duty Black Ops. So now the idea is the FTC is like, well, if people want Call of Duty Black Ops day one, and they used to have Game Pass for console, then they'll have to upgrade to Game Pass Ultimate in order to get it as a day one exclusive. Again, the caveat that you mentioned earlier, Aaron, that kind of throws a weird like wrench in everything is that if you already are paying for Game Pass for console, you can keep paying for that until you forget or not forget, but you cancel the sub. So like if you just presumably, if you just keep paying your Game Pass for console subscription, you can do that indefinitely. There are no plans to fully depreciate the service.
It's not getting fully sunset. It's just going to exist in kind of a weird back room of the retail space that you can only get into if you have the special key.
But it does suck for people that had canceled their subscriptions at some point and were like, I'm not really using console Game Pass very much right now. I'm going to cancel it. I'll just get it, back before Black Ops 6 so that I can play it for way less money. Those people are out of luck. They are going to have to pay a pretty sizable amount more than what they would have been paying previously. Although another interesting thing, I know I keep saying a lot of interesting things, Aaron, is...
There's a lot of interesting things here.
Yeah. So with the product degradation point, where the FTC was saying that basically Game Pass Standard is not as good as, Game Pass for console, and it also costs more money. It's like, technically that's not true because Game Pass for console didn't come with Xbox Live, and Xbox Live Gold was $10. So if you were paying for Xbox Live Gold and you were paying for Game Pass for console, you were paying $20. So technically, Microsoft has a point when they come back to the FTC and they say, well, actually, Game Pass Standard is a better deal because you're getting our catalog of Game Pass games, you're getting Xbox Live Gold, you're getting Xbox discounts. Previously you had to pay $20 for that. And then if you look at Game Pass Ultimate, they're just saying, well, it's the same amount that you would have been paying because you were paying for Xbox Live Gold and you were paying for Game Pass on console. And both of those services were $10. So it's this like really muddy thing where I definitely think what Microsoft is doing is kind of sketchy and questionable, especially because it does seem very apparent that this is preceding the Black Ops 6 launch, which is going to be big. Xbox knows it's going to be big. But at the same time, there's this like weird back and forth with the FTC where they're criticizing things. And Xbox and Microsoft are not invalid in their kind of comments back to the FTC, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance to this that I think is to some degree getting lost in people's just overall frustration and fatigue with subscription services constantly changing their prices. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that gaming subscription services have never, well, at least up to this point, have not operated on the scale of Xbox Game Pass, right? Like, we can get into comparison points between PlayStation Plus and Game Pass at a later time in the conversation, but in my opinion, they're playing in the exact same market, but they're trying to achieve very different things ultimately. Game Pass ultimately. But the price increase in a lot of cases here does kind of make sense. But yeah, I think kind of reading it at face value, it's hard not to tie the timing of this directly to the release of a new juggernaut multi-platform franchise. And if Xbox is kind of trying to streamline the way that it handles its online subscription service, it's ultimately, well, again, Game Pass ultimately going to be by its nature the first time that a gaming subscription service has had to tread through these waters because it just kind of hasn't happened before. So I think the conversation is kind of ebbing and flowing more with people's reaction to needing to pay more than it is from like a deep dive understanding of like the actual finances of operating something like this. But that having been said, I do think it's fairly damning, the timing. But then again, you can always point to the actual let's call it beefing up of Xbox's first-party lineup. One of the reasons that I have heard people talk about the Game Pass day one launches not really having been a hugely strong selling point, even outside of, a handful of releases here and there over the last couple of years, is that there haven't been more than a handful of releases, first-party titles from Xbox over the last couple of years. So with a billion more coming up, as evidenced by the, Summer Game Fest showcase and whatnot, you can make the argument that this price increase and restructuring is probably more forward-thinking than just a Call of Duty move, and that they're looking to make good on their investments into games like Indiana Jones and the Great Golden Hullabaloo, or whatever it's called, Perfect Dark, the new Doom, Fable, a whole bunch of games that they've been investing in the background for years through these acquisitions and whatnot are now actually going to be coming to the platforms, and they need to find a way to make the books balance in terms of losing day one revenue on sales for $70 games, but also, acquiring new users and keeping people in their ecosystem playing the games and still making a profit on them. I realize that was all kind of a little bit rambly, but I don't think that ultimately this entire thing is as simple as price go up equal bad. I think there are nuances to it that are fairly damning, but I don't think it's as simple as, price go up is bad. And I don't think that's the crux of the FTC's complaints. I think those are fairly valid, but I do think that Xbox has a good built-in rebuttal to that as well, that I think they'll keep them in, perfectly cool legal waters.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and then the FCC also had the criticism around the layoffs that happened after the acquisition and calling those a reduced investment in product quality and development. And looking at both of those criticisms, I definitely think there are some valid points to both of them. The product degradation and the price increase, like you were saying, it's a complicated situation because Microsoft can say, like you were saying, no, it has nothing to do with just Call of Duty. It has to do with the fact that this year alone, we've got Call of Duty, we have Avowed, we have Flight Sim 2024, we have the new Indiana Jones games. These are all fairly large games that they showed at the showcase, and people are excited about them, and we want to make sure that we are profiting off of our, exclusive Xbox Game Studios titles. And also now that we've got a lot more of these, we want to put in this additional tiering to, kind of make all the finances make sense. And I think that they feel like they probably have a better justification for that change because they have so many titles, like you said.
Right.
So it's a messy time because, they can say that. Do they believe that? They probably believe that a little bit, but I do think a lot of it's centered around Call of Duty as well.
Yeah. I mean, it would have to be because I think that to ignore the outsized impact that Call of Duty had on the $69 billion Activision Blizzard acquisition in the first place, you can't ignore Call of Duty's impact on that. Mm-hmm. Xbox looked at in comparison, the minor exclusivity deals that Sony had kind of negotiated with Activision for Call of Duty releases, where there was, exclusive content here and there, early access stuff, things like that on PlayStation consoles. And they said, well, but what if we just owned it? They weren't, content to be fighting for scraps. They wanted the lion's share of the pie. Not that lions are really known for eating pie, but who knows? Yeah, so I don't think that you can justifiably ignore the way that a corporation would view losing the revenue on what is routinely the biggest release of any given year across the world. To ignore that would just be to willfully blind yourself to the reality of how these sorts of things operate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also just a really good opportunity for them to do two things that I think are really important. One, and this has to do, what's driving the change. There's been really low adoption of Game Pass across console users at this point, because my understanding is the attach rate between having an Xbox and having Game Pass is really high, which is to say most people that have an Xbox also have Game Pass. And so if that's the case, and also there's data that suggests the majority of users already have Game Pass Ultimate. If that's the case, that means that they've already got the majority of the users that they can get on console, and they're not going to have like the massive increases with revenue that they were seeing when the service initially came out. Like the number isn't going up, so to speak. That being said, PC doesn't have as many Game Pass users, so it's an area where they can see a lot of potential growth. And now that we've got Call of Duty Black Ops coming out, and it'll be on PC, it'll be on console, that provides a great opportunity for them to have people on console upgrade from, whatever version of, one, either go to Game Pass Ultimate if they had no Game Pass, or, maybe they weren't subscribed and now they're going to go to Game Pass Ultimate. So they'll get a bunch of revenue from Game Pass people on console. And then anyone that's on PC that wants to play Call of Duty Black Ops 6 day one for a cheaper price is probably going to get Game Pass for PC, because Game Pass for PC was largely not touched at all by these changes. It went up by like $2, but all of the features in it are exactly the same. And $2 is just not a particularly... I mean, obviously, everyone's in different everybody has different financial situations, but it is not the most egregious of the price changes that we've seen during this whole process. And a lot of people are thinking, including myself, that the reason that Game Pass for PC wasn't touched so much is because they have a lot of growth that they could do on PC in terms of converting users to being Game Pass subscribers. And as a result, it makes a lot of sense for them to still give you day one games on Game Pass for PC and not touch the price a ton. So that's how COD can really help them moving forward. I think you know this, Aaron, but that was my over elaboration of it.
No, I think it's a really solid point. It actually leads me into another kind of... When I say boon for Microsoft, I don't mean for that to sound like it's necessarily an overall net positive for everybody. Because ultimately, man, I really have to stop saying ultimately in a conversation about Game Pass Ultimate, because it throws me off track literally every time. The thing that I think is going to be fascinating about this is the Call of Duty timing as leading into this upcoming season of Xbox exclusives. Well, not Xbox exclusives, but Microsoft first-party titles finally starting to come out on a regular basis. Is I was listening to, and I want to say it was GameSpot had a podcast that I was listening to on this topic, and they were referring to the cycle by which subscription services like Netflix tend to update their payment, by which I mean up their payment structures. And a lot of the time, the reason that people don't just cancel outright when a price goes up on something like that, which is candidly what I did, because I fell into the category that Zach was just talking about of people who have an Xbox. It came with Xbox Game Pass Ultimate for a month or 2 months or whatever the trial period was. And then the value of having access to that library of titles that I didn't just need to go out and purchase from the ground up was so appealing that I've now paid for it for the better part of a year. Because it was just that easy to have the console, have Game Pass, and not need to worry about, cherry picking the games that I wanted to play. I just had this great catalog. But nope, I have canceled my Xbox Game Pass Ultimate. It is just not worth $20 a month to me. I do not use it anywhere near enough for that to be an actual value for me at this point in my life. Sorry. But the reason that so many people don't tend to do that when there are price changes with like Netflix is because the first reaction is usually, okay, well, this is finally going to be the thing that pushes me off of paying every month for Netflix. And then you sit down and you go, okay, well, I do watch this show and I do watch that show, and my girlfriend watches this show and the kids watch that show, and I have my friend on it and they watch this. And by the time you get around to it, you realize that there are a lot of things that you don't want to miss, and you've already bought into having access to these things readily. So actually letting go of that subscription is too much of a hassle for a lot of people, or, you know, it does leverage FOMO to some degree, or it would just inconvenience too many people to remove access to those shows in that catalog from their lives. Now, I would wager, much like the podcasters I was listening to did, that most people don't have that same relationship with Xbox Game Pass, because I sure as shit know I didn't. But they may be able to get around that by putting something as seasonally focused and constantly updated as a Call of Duty, right? If the most affordable, in quotations, the ostensibly most affordable way to access Call of Duty, which is a fascinating, almost I mean, it is a live service title, but it's a live service title that releases $70 iterations every year. And so if people find that just lumping that into a subscription service is a more cost-effective way for them to access the Call of Duty that they're going to be playing year after year after year after year, then you are starting to engender people to your service in the same way that like a Netflix or an Amazon Prime has. And then on the tail of that, once you start introducing the people who are already in your ecosystem to all of your first-party titles, you now actually have a product that will theoretically keep people tied in, and consistent releases will keep people wanting to stay in. So I think in this case, they may be using Call of Duty as, you know, an acquisition offset for the people like me who are canceling outright to get people in before they hit them with constant more Call of Duty updates and then that first party catalog finally coming out, which I think comes with its own set of risks. But I think this is a pretty clear play to get people to adopt with a juggernaut and then stay for the gems.
Well, I think the interesting thing that Call of Duty kind of exemplifies is when I was watching the microcast for GameIndustry.biz, one of the things that came up as an issue for Game Pass is the way that a lot of people play video games now is they play like one or two. They play one or two like live service games, and they play a lot of it, and they don't necessarily play a bunch of other games. So that's really rough for something like Game Pass, because Game Pass is really there to kind of entice you to try new games, entice you to try new titles, all that kind of stuff. There are a ton of very, very, very good games on Game Pass, but things like Hi-Fi Rush, for example, great game, it's not going to be something that you play for years on end, probably, because it's not meant to be played in that way. It's not meant to be ingested in that way. It's not a live service. Things like Call of Duty, things like League of Legends, things like Rocket League, these are games that Diablo, Path of Exile, etc. Those are games people play, and it will be like one of their pillars of gaming that they just play every single day. They sink a ton of hours into it. It is one of the games that they care about. If Xbox gets enough games like that on their platform, it 100% has the possibility of keeping people locked in on Game Pass, because then all the games that they play are on Game Pass. And part of like the human psychology of it too is the buy-in is a lot lower. So even though like you might forget you're paying for Game Pass and end up paying way more money than you would if you just bought COD, you know, standalone. You might forget that, you know, maybe that's just not something you really think about because you're only getting charged $20 a month instead of, you know, an upfront $70. But the gateway to like playing the game is just easier. And you get all these other benefits like Xbox Live Gold, right? Like if you're playing Call of Duty, you're probably playing it online. So it makes sense to have Xbox Live Gold. And there's all these other things. So I just think it's really interesting. I think they definitely need more titles like COD to be on Game Pass. These evergreen titles that people are just playing an absolute shit ton of, because they're going to get more users that way. I personally wish people played more games, had a wider variety of things, but I'm also guilty of doing the same thing. You know, like I play a lot of World of Warcraft. I get sucked into these games that are kind of evergreen, so to speak. But it's an interesting thing that you bring up, because that's one of the comments that GameIndustry.biz had, was that part of the issue with the business model for Game Pass and even PlayStation Plus is people are really just playing a few games these days. They're not jumping around as much as they used to, just because live service games are meant to be played all the goddamn time. And they're always competing with everything for your time.
And to a certain extent, a lot of single-player games are, the scale is not necessarily going down on the biggest hits, right? So, I mean, for me, Elden Ring is the gift that keeps on giving, because I'm still deep in that, and I'm chipping away I'm trying to get an hour or two in every day if I can, manage to squeeze the time in. Most days I don't, but I'm going to be playing that game for a long time, and I don't need a subscription service for it. I have it downloaded, but, that's, kind of the idea. But I think it does kind of also point to one of the key differences between what Xbox is trying to achieve with Game Pass and what PlayStation Plus is trying to do. And in a lot of ways, I actually think it does make PlayStation Plus seem a lot weaker by comparison, just kind of as an overall product offering. But I won't get hugely into that. I think because PlayStation's first-party catalog is so heavily populated by, as Zach and I have talked about before, third-person single-player action games. Obviously, they're trying to make a play with Concord and do some other fun stuff in there, but by and large, the catalog of prestige titles that PlayStation likes to tout are, your Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, God of War, a lot of games that kind of follow a similar formula, even if they're very experientially different. Mm-hmm. Those are not necessarily, outside of, needing a sizable time investment to beat some of them, they're not necessarily the games that are going to be bringing people back in for the entire year. Once the game is beaten, and then they'll maybe move on to the next thing. But with Call of Duty, like I said, it's its own live service that functions on a title-by-title basis in addition to its actual live service title. So Xbox can almost turn Game Pass into a COD subscription in a lot of ways. And just use that as the live service draw. They may not need that many more live service juggernauts outside of Call of Duty in order to justify the live service savings by just having Game Pass.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense? I'm not sure if I explained that particularly well.
No, I think it makes sense. It's really just they need more games that people are engaging with in a live service manner on Game Pass. They don't need more games that are like Ghost of Tsushima or Uncharted, or obviously these are all PlayStation exclusives that I'm listing, but I definitely agree with your point. When people play those kinds of games, I think a lot of people just beat it once and they'll kind of try to bum rush it. Some people take their time, I'm sure, but generally speaking, at least all my friends, I think they try to play through something as quickly as possible if they have the time to do it. So I definitely, it's not to say that there's not value in having those single player experiences on Game Pass, but I think Game Pass definitely benefits from large replayable multiplayer games, especially because it loops in their Xbox Live service.
Exactly. And I also, not to cut you off or accidentally tangent off, but I think it's important, at least for me, to distinguish that when I say all of these things are, good ideas or make sense or would be a boon, I'm not necessarily saying that I like the idea personally, because I can see if this gamble pays off for Xbox, I can see these subscription services treating your single-player titles more like value adds to the subscription that gives you access to the live service games. The live service games are the revenue drivers of these new subscription platforms, and the single-player offerings that are kind of dolloped in are more of the... Again, they're more of a value add. They're the stuff that you play when the seasonal content dries up because you have access to it. And I don't personally like that as a foundational shift in the gaming industry, but I do see where it makes sense strategically for a business that's already committed to live service as a business model to start to contextualize their releases like that. I see where the suits and ties can find, can see dollar signs in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a situation where we're more just describing the reasons behind something, not applying a moral assessment of that thing. Because the rough situation is, I like Game Pass as a service. I think it's a useful service. I like it. I think their ethos of kind of trying to get people to play new games that maybe they wouldn't have played otherwise is really neat. There's a lot of games that I'll almost buy on Steam, and then someone tells me, oh, you can play that for free on Game Pass. And it's like, oh, well, that's great. Like, I don't need to spend money to try and play this game. And then, maybe I'll buy it later. Maybe I won't, right? I think that that's a question for whether Game Pass is healthy for the games industry in general. But as a consumer, I like Game Pass. So I ideally would like for it to survive. And I think this all ties into kind of the final point that I at least put down for what's kind of driving the change, which is to say that day one releases on Game Pass, them being included as part of that, people lose out on a lot of money. Microsoft loses out on some money. The developers lose out on some money. It is not cheap for them to offer day one, especially first party day one releases, because they could just be making way more, like hand over fist, because you're comparing a $20 subscription to a $70 base game price. That's, you're just like, that's under half of what they would make if you just bought the game straight up. And granted, I don't know the exact split of where all the money goes and whatnot, but the reality is that it is expensive to offer day one releases. They were not acquiring enough new users on console, at least. And when you're talking about subscription services where you're concerned about number of users, you're concerned about churn rate, you're concerned about the revenue per user, if you're not getting new users in and your revenue isn't going up and, your churn rate is kind of staying stable, well, what are you going to do? You're going to have to increase revenue per user. And so that's what we're seeing right now. And the way that they're doing that is by price gating those day one releases. So That's the last thing I wanted to mention, because I think that kind of explains, well, why are they putting this like differentiator in this higher bundle? And it's like, well, because it's expensive to run this service. And Microsoft seems very intent on wanting to make it work. I personally like Game Pass as an experiment. I think it provides value to my life. I would like to see it succeed. So that's maybe why I'm a little bit less critical about this point. But this was a concern that the FTC had, was that Microsoft was just trying to acquire more users by buying Activision, and that they weren't actually trying to make it a better product, and that they weren't going to be able to sustain a Game Pass because it wasn't profitable. And, I will be honest that these price changes seem to suggest that Game Pass may not be as profitable as some people may have thought, or as a lot of people were predicting. And I think that is perhaps a little bit concerning.
I think that's entirely possible. I don't, again, not being as dialed into the actual numbers that Game Pass is doing in terms of profitability, I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable. I will make broad assumptions that it would be really, I would be surprised if it was generating an insane amount of profit, just because the strangest thing about the price hike, and I think one of the things that has rubbed people the wrong way with it, and to some extent has rubbed me the wrong way with it again, is that a lot of the time you'll see subscription services wait to hit something approximating market saturation before they will start increasing their price. Like, they will overwhelm you with value up front and operate at a loss, so that they can then later try and recoup that profit.
I thought you were actually going to bring that up earlier. When you were talking about Netflix and all the other things, and you were talking about the podcast, I was expecting you to go into like the startup mentality of like, first you have something really, really cheap that has such good value that people can't possibly turn it up. Turn it up. And then once you have so many people, you're like, all right, now it's time to raise the temp, so to speak.
Yeah, that it didn't seem to quite line there, but it would have probably worked out just fine. But yeah, so like that's the traditional model that you have probably seen happen 1,000 times with different things that you subscribe to. Um, but Xbox does not seem to have followed that playbook, and it'll be interesting to see how that particular gamble pays off as well, because the other interesting thing that kind of ties into this, that came from one of the source, or not source videos, but one of the research materials that you gave us from Bellular again, Zachary, would be talking about how they're trying to use cloud gaming to broaden people's access to Game Pass, rather, by not tying it to any particular piece of hardware, which, you know, is obviously a great idea. If you can so thoroughly democratize the gaming experience, because high-speed internet is more accessible to people than expensive boxes, and potentially more appealing to people, because the vast majority of users, I think, look for convenience before anything. And in the era of zero physical media, even needing something as cumbersome as a console to stream stuff to is almost becoming an outdated idea to younger generations. So being able to play your favorite Xbox games on an Amazon Fire Stick is a great way to reach families who can afford a subscription but don't think they can afford, you know, a $600 box, right? Because you can go to, I almost said Bed Bath and Beyond, a no longer extant store, to, you know, buy an Amazon Fire Stick out of a discount bin at checkout, and suddenly you have an Xbox, right? Like, that's cool, but they are also gating that service behind the highest price tier, which is kind of an interesting choice. So they seem to have thrown the acquisition playbook out and are kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too, by increasing prices and acquiring more users simultaneously, rather than acquiring users and then increasing prices. So it's an interesting maneuver on their part.
Well, I would actually disagree in the sense that I just don't know that the cloud play, I think, is just a weaker one for them. So I don't think that I don't know that they view the people playing cloud games on an Amazon Fire Stick, for example, as being large enough to justify having its own tier segment. Because I think if they were to put those people on the same tier as like the console players, they would still be losing out on money. I think where they're going for user acquisition is on PC, which is why you don't see a big change on Game Pass for PC. So I think that they're still following the playbook. I think if they can get enough people on PC to move over to Game Pass, we are going to see a situation where PC users are expected to fall in line, and it's probably going to go away and become part of Game Pass Ultimate, just like it happened to console. I think PC has been spared because they are trying to do user acquisition in the stereotypical way, and they haven't gotten where they want to be yet. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to be part of Game Pass and you only have a PC, you should get on it now before they increase the price, because if they do end up getting user acquisition, like a lot of it's going to go up. Like, that is just how the pricing model for these things work. You get the users. Once you have the users, you have them locked in, you increase the price. Yeah, you're going to have some churn, but a lot of the time, I'm pretty sure they probably take that price increase into consideration for churn rate.
Oh, guaranteed. And the timing of the announcement in advance of the actual price hike was, I mean, I'm sure calculated such that they thought they could recoup the loss and then top the numbers, probably just with the release of a Call of Duty game, realistically. So that the churn is almost going to be negligible, probably, for Xbox. Like, they're not worried about me.
There was a interesting comment, and this will be kind of the last thing that I bring up because I'm looking at the time here, but there was an interesting comment on that GameIndustry.biz micro chat where, when they were talking about day one releases, and specifically Call of Duty, the guy that was talking about everything, not the like chief editor for them, I unfortunately didn't write down either of their names, but the other guy who was offering up more opinions was saying that in his mind, Microsoft should look at cutting all of the exclusivity stuff and just really trying to focus on being multi-plat, because then they get to benefit from the increased margin of games being released at full price on like Sony. And they can still have games on Game Pass. So it's like, oh yeah, you can play Avowed on your PlayStation. That's completely fine. Or you can play it for free if you want to use Game Pass. And I think that it's interesting because he was bringing up that he thinks there's a world where you can offer both. Like you can have your games come out day one on Game Pass, but them not be an exclusive title and also come out on Sony, and that won't necessarily cannibalize and might actually end up being a situation where you end up making more money because you're getting more margin from other platforms, and then you're getting the people that were going to Game Pass. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and specifically the thing that I thought was even more interesting was the comment that they were making about how much influence does the console war and Xbox fanboys have on, Microsoft's business model around exclusivity? Because you best know, if you haven't been on Twitter, then maybe don't. But if you haven't been on Twitter, the console wars are real, especially on Twitter. And people have such ridiculously stupid and shitty opinions that if Xbox, for example, was to say, fuck exclusivity, some Microsoft people would flip the fuck out. And sorry, when I say Microsoft, I actually mean Xbox. And when I say Xbox, I don't mean people that work at Xbox. I mean fanboys. People that do not work at Xbox, people that have bought so deeply into the product that it's like part of their identity to a point of toxicity. And I just wonder, like, would the console wars, does that ultimately mean Microsoft can't really do multiplat because they would be so kind of chastised for this decision to share their games with PlayStation? If you can't tell, I hate the console wars. They're so fucking stupid. But anyway, it was just an interesting point. I don't know that I know the answer to that. I just know that there are some very vitriolic people in the community when it comes to Xbox needs to be superior and everything. And, PlayStation has its people too. But I thought it was an interesting comment or thought.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think strategically Xbox needs to, like, we should all probably just assume that Xbox is aware of the fact that they have bought the means of production on these titles, not just their distribution, for a reason, right? Because, I mean, they are going to be doing basically exactly what we've described with Call of Duty because it is going to be multiplat. So they're already testing the waters with that sort of thing. Like, how much will this drive Game Pass revenue? How much are we making on the release of these games, on other platforms that are not directly controlled by Xbox? And I'm sure that will influence the decision-making for future exclusive titles. I don't know. I guess I have like a weird moment where I don't really care about Sony exclusive games being released on other platforms. Like, I kind of get a little kick out of the idea that PC gamers can play Ghost of Tsushima, God of War, The Last of Us, because, just because they're PlayStation Studios doesn't mean those experiences need to be exclusive to a particular box or a particular controller. That just feels unnecessarily like taking ownership of art that isn't yours, and saying, well, you shouldn't get to enjoy that, I don't necessarily think that that's ultimately a very productive perspective to have in general. But there are a lot of people, like you said, who do have that opinion and hold it very, very close to their hearts because for whatever reason, they feel the need to align so strongly with one brand over another that it becomes a key component of their personality. We've all been there. I think it's a lot of teens who then grow out of it, but I also think that there's just people who like being angry on the internet and need to find the flavor of the week. There's a whole lot more that I feel like we could talk about with this, but we do not have time. I don't think. One of the things that I was a little bit interested by was the idea of how the development cycle for actual devs may change as a result of needing to keep a subscription service afloat, right? Because it's not necessarily like PlayStation gaming is going to die itself during a drought, but a subscription service may hemorrhage users during a content drought. That's why you see so much content being added to services like Netflix.
Yep.
But, if games, which are already on a tumultuous turnaround, need to start conforming to the publisher cycle, by which I mean the platform of, subscription services, I think there's some pitfalls there. 150,000 other things that we could dive way into in terms of implications. But I think for the time being, my kind of takeaway with this is that this price hike was inevitable. The timing is certainly questionable, but I think ultimately, again, I'm just going to say it one more time. I think Game Pass ultimately, this is Xbox and Microsoft making a very calculated, very bold gamble with what they think they need to do and what they think people will be willing to accept at a very pivotal moment for the platform in general, because the success or failure of this new pricing model alongside juggernaut releases like Call of Duty will ultimately determine, if not the fate of Game Pass, then certainly the form it takes in the years going forward.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Xbox, candidly, we all know this, lost the actual console war in the sense of like sales. Xbox has not done well comparatively to PlayStation sales for the last 2 generations, and I think that Microsoft and Xbox view Game Pass as their way to kind of level the playing field. Well, I don't even want to put it that way, because I don't even know that Game Pass is like a comparative, like competitive thing with PlayStation. I just think they see it as their future. I think that this is really what they've committed to, and they're committed to trying to make it work. And I'm not providing like a moral assessment of whether I think this is right or wrong. I think everybody can kind of make their own assessment with that, but that's ultimately what's driving this price change, is they think they need to do this price change to make sure that the platform is profitable ultimately and can be sustained. There have been discussions about whether Game Pass was profitable for a while. There have been conversations about, is the service going to be something that can withstand the test of time? Is it not? Can they keep doing day one releases? This conversation's been going on for so long that I can't really look at Microsoft and be like, oh, this is a really cold and calculated thing to like fuck everybody over just because Black Ops is coming out. Like, this was going to happen probably regardless, and they just saw that Black Ops was probably the most reasonable time to do it, and they just had a really strong showing at the Summer Game Fest. They probably just looked at all that and said, well, this is the best time to do it, because if we don't have anything coming out and then there's a price hike, we're going to look extra bad compared to if we have stuff coming out and then we do a price hike, it's going to look a little bit less egregious. Again, it's all capitalism. It's all bullshit. Everybody sucks. We hate everything in reality. But like, it's welcome to the system we live in, baby. Last thing I was going to say
became Banksy.
Yeah. Last thing I was going to say is, and you alluded to it, is and maybe we'll do an episode on it. Maybe we won't. I don't know. There's a lot of really interesting implications around like if Game Pass and subscription services are successful in the games industry, what are the implications of that for game studios? Maybe we'll do a talk on that at some point. If we don't, you should totally look into it. It's super interesting. For example, I didn't know, but this console generation, there have been fewer games sold than any other previous generation. And some people blame subscription services for that. I would argue it's probably more likely that it's live services that are the main issue, but, who knows? So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff around that. So maybe at some point, Aaron, we'll talk about it, but that is neither here nor there.
And then to close this out on just a little mini silver lining in terms of things in an uncertain environment, kind of, at the very least, a little bit of control being put back into developers' hands. Over the last couple of weeks at Microsoft alone, we have seen the formation of the 2 largest wall-to-wall unions underneath Microsoft. This is just basically a little end-of-show shout-out, but Bethesda, the development teams over at Bethesda formed what was, for a very brief time, the largest wall-to-wall union of developers at Microsoft, and then that number was within days topped by Activision Blizzard, which formed a very large union, with a well-respected union, and they're going to be, leveraging for more, workers' rights, AI protections, kind of like what's going on with the other big deal that's happening in the world, the SAG, video game actors, voice actors strike, which is its whole thing. But yeah, so at the very least, in all of this, game developers themselves are taking some of the control back into their own hands in terms of what their future looks like in the development world. So while everything else changes, that's at least one positive development, or rather two positive developments.
Another positive development is the fact that eDougie Art helped us originally with our wonderful logo and art.
It is a positive development several years ago.
Yeah, it was a positive development several years ago. Had that
the
never
impacts
happened,
can still be felt today.
Yeah. This here is where some patches required hosts, and eDougie Art signed a formal agreement that they would talk about her at the end of every episode. I don't know. I'm a loser. Anyway, ignore me, but you should check out eDougie Art. eDougie Art can be found on Etsy and on Instagram under the same name. That's at eDougie Art. Show some love, and don't make weird old-timey jokes like an old man like I just attempted to, because then you'll look dumb in front of a bunch of people, and you don't want that.
I almost went into the introduction of Beach Girl, the purveyor of our wonderful intro and outro music, with an old-timey voice, but then I actually bailed on it, not for fear of looking like a loser, but rather for fear that I wouldn't be able to maintain a convincing old man voice for long enough. So in my normal voice, I'm going to encourage you to check out Beach Girl. Spotify may cost a good fair amount of money, but the music that you can listen to of Beach Girls on it is more than worth it, in my opinion. I listen to Beach Girl regularly still, and I do so with enthusiasm and gusto, so I encourage you to do the same. Find them, like I said, on Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, basically anywhere that digital music can be procured and then pumped into your ears. So yeah, that is, again, Beach Girl. Show them some love.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in today. We appreciate you as always. Tune in next time where we talk about the fate of Star Wars, the Old Republic. I don't know. I was trying to think of something funny. We're not going to talk about Star Wars, more than likely. Of course, now something will happen and then we will. But anyway.
Tune in next week, next episode, for our Star Wars Outlaws deep dive.
Hell yeah.
Everyone's thrilled about that one.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye!
Oh, that feels kind of bad.